The Caribbean sun blazed mercilessly overhead as Isabella Moreau clung to the splintered remains of what had once been the merchant ship Santa Esperanza. Her fingers, raw and bleeding from gripping the rough wood, trembled as another wave crashed over her makeshift raft. Salt water burned her cracked lips and stung her eyes, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the betrayal that had landed her here. "Please," she had begged Captain Valdez just hours before. "I trusted you with my father's cargo. You gave me your word." The captain's weathered face had twisted into a cruel smile. "Your father's debts are not my concern, señorita. The cargo is mine now, and you are a liability I cannot afford." Isabella's mind replayed those final moments aboard the ship. The crew had seized her without warning, ignoring her pleas and protests. She had watched in horror as they loaded her father's precious spice shipment, cinnamon, vanilla, and rare saffron from their family plantation in Martinique, into their own holds. Everything her family had worked for, gone in an instant. The rope burns on her wrists told the story of her struggle as they had bound her and thrown her overboard with nothing but a piece of broken mast to keep her afloat. The Santa Esperanza had disappeared beyond the horizon, taking with it her hopes of saving her family's failing business and her own future. Now, as the afternoon sun beat down on the endless expanse of turquoise water, Isabella felt her strength ebbing away. Her simple white cotton dress, once pristine for the business meeting in Port Royal, now clung to her body like a shroud. The Caribbean heat was unforgiving, and she could feel her skin blistering despite her olive complexion. "Mama," she whispered, thinking of her mother back in Martinique, probably preparing dinner and wondering why her daughter hadn't sent word. "Papa, forgive me. I failed you both." The waves seemed to respond to her despair, growing larger and more violent. One particularly massive swell lifted her high into the air, giving her a momentary view of the vast ocean before dropping her back down into the trough. In that brief moment, she thought she saw something dark against the horizon, but when she looked again, there was nothing but endless blue. Her throat burned with thirst. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was surrounded by water yet dying of thirst. She had tried drinking seawater in her desperation, but it had only made her more nauseous and disoriented. The hallucinations had started hours ago. She kept seeing her father's face in the clouds, hearing her mother's voice calling her name on the wind. As the day wore on, Isabella's grip on the wood began to loosen. Her body felt heavy, waterlogged, and her vision blurred in and out of focus. She thought about the life she was leaving behind, the small but comfortable house overlooking the harbor in Fort-de-France, the smell of her mother's bouillon on Sunday mornings, the dreams she'd had of expanding the family spice business across the Caribbean. "I'm sorry." "Papa," she gasped, her voice barely audible over the sound of the waves. "I tried to be strong like you taught me." The sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. Under different circumstances, Isabella might have found it beautiful. Now it only reminded her that another day was ending, possibly her last. Just as her eyes began to close for what she thought might be the final time, a shadow fell across her face. She forced her eyes open, expecting to see a cloud blocking the sun. Instead, she saw the dark silhouette of a ship's hull rising above her like a mountain. The vessel was unlike anything she had ever seen. Where merchant ships were painted in bright colors to attract business, this one was painted black as midnight. Its sails, also black, billowed in the wind like the wings of some great predatory bird. Even in her weakened state, Isabella could make out the intricate carvings on the ship's bow, serpents and sea creatures, intertwined in an elaborate dance of death and rebirth. Voices called out from above in a mixture of languages, Spanish, English, French, and others she couldn't identify. She tried to call back, but her voice was nothing more than a hoarse croak. Panic seized her as she realized the ship might pass her by, leaving her to die as surely as if Captain Valdez had put a bullet in her head. With her last ounce of strength, she raised her arm and waved, the movement sending sharp pains through her sunburned shoulders. The effort nearly caused her to lose her grip on the wood, but somehow she managed to hold on. A rope splashed into the water beside her, and she looked up to see a figure leaning over the ship's rail. Even through her blurred vision, she could tell this was no ordinary sailor. He was tall and lean, with long dark hair that whipped around his face in the ocean breeze. His shirt was open, revealing a chest crossed with scars that spoke of countless battles. But it was his eyes that held her, dark as the ship's paint, intense and calculating, yet not without compassion. "Can you hold on?" He called down to her in accented English that carried hints of Spanish nobility, mixed with something rougher, more dangerous. Isabella tried to nod but found she could barely keep her head up. The man seemed to understand her predicament because he was already swinging over the rail, sliding down the rope with the fluid grace of someone who had spent his life at sea. When he hit the water beside her, she was surprised by how warm and solid he felt in the cold, endless ocean. His arm came around her waist and she was dimly aware of him securing the rope around both of them with practiced efficiency. "I've got you," he murmured, his voice close to her ear. "You're safe now." As they were hauled up toward the deck, Isabella's consciousness began to fade. The last thing she remembered was the feeling of strong arms lifting her over the rail and a voice, his voice, calling for rum and dry clothes. Then everything went black, and for the first time in hours she wasn't afraid of what might happen next. Isabella awoke to the gentle rocking of a ship and the sound of waves against a hull. For a moment she thought she was back aboard the Santa Esperanza, and the betrayal had all been a terrible nightmare. But as her senses sharpened, she realized she was lying in a bed far more comfortable than any she'd ever experienced at sea. The sheets were fine cotton, and the mattress was actually soft rather than the straw-stuffed pallets common on merchant vessels. She opened her eyes to find herself in what could only be described as a captain's cabin, but unlike any she'd ever seen. Rich mahogany paneling lined the walls, and expensive-looking maps were spread across a large desk. Books in multiple languages filled built-in shelves, and she caught titles in Spanish, English, French, and what looked like Portuguese. Oil paintings depicting sea battles and exotic ports hung between portholes that let in the golden light of what appeared to be late afternoon. "Ah, you're awake." Isabella turned toward the voice and found herself looking at the man who had pulled her from the water. In the cabin's warm lamplight she could see him more clearly. He was perhaps 30 years old, with olive skin that spoke of Spanish heritage and hair so dark it was almost black, tied back with a leather cord. His face was aristocratic. High cheekbones, a straight nose, and a strong jaw softened only slightly by what might have been a day's worth of beard. He wore a white linen shirt open at the collar, dark leather pants, and boots that looked expensive enough to buy a small plantation. But it was his eyes that held her attention. They were the color of strong coffee, intelligent and intense, with a hint of something dangerous lurking beneath the surface. When he smiled, she noticed his teeth were remarkably white and straight, another sign that he wasn't your typical pirate. "How do you feel?" he asked, approaching the bed with a pewter cup in his hands. "You've been unconscious for nearly 6 hours." Isabella's voice came out as a croak and she winced at the sound. "I'm alive." "Indeed you are, though I must say you came remarkably close to not being so." He held out the cup. "Drink this. It's water with a bit of lime juice. It will help with the dehydration." Isabella struggled to sit up, and he immediately moved to help her, his hands surprisingly gentle as he supported her shoulders. She was acutely aware that someone had changed her clothes. She now wore a clean white shirt that was obviously too large for her, and a pair of canvas pants rolled up at the ankles. My dress?" she managed to ask after taking a sip of the water. "It was ruined beyond saving. Salt water and sun, I'm afraid. My quartermaster found you some spare clothes from our supplies." He seemed to understand her concern because he added, "Don't worry. He's quite respectful, and I supervised the entire process." "Your modesty was preserved." Isabella nodded, grateful but still embarrassed. She took another sip of water, feeling strength slowly returning to her body. "Thank you," she said finally. "You saved my life." The man inclined his head in acknowledgement. "I am Captain Alejandro Vega," he said, and Isabella caught the slight emphasis on his title. "This is my ship, the Venganza Negra." Even in her weakened state, Isabella recognized the name. The Black Vengeance was legendary throughout the Caribbean. A ship that appeared without warning, struck with devastating efficiency, and vanished before naval forces could respond. "And its captain, you're the pirate prince," she whispered. Alejandro's smile widened, and she saw both pride and amusement in his expression. "So they call me, though I prefer to think of myself as a gentleman of fortune." He settled into a chair near the bed, his movements graceful and controlled. "And you are?" "Isabella." Isabella Moreau. She paused, then added, "My family has a spice plantation in Martinique." "Ah, French colonial." Alejandro nodded as if this explained something. "And what was a young woman of good breeding doing floating alone in the middle of the Caribbean Sea?" The question brought back all the pain and anger of her betrayal. Isabella's jaw tightened as she remembered Captain Valdez's treacherous smile. "I was aboard a merchant ship, the Santa Esperanza. The captain, he stole my cargo and threw me overboard." Alejandro's expression darkened immediately. "What cargo?" "Spices from our family plantation. Cinnamon, vanilla, saffron. Worth more than most people make in 5 years. It was supposed to save our business." Isabella's voice broke slightly. "My father trusted me to make the deal in Port Royal and I failed him." "You trusted the wrong person," Alejandro corrected firmly. "That's not failure, that's experience. The question is what you intend to do about it." Isabella looked at him in surprise. "Do about it? I'm lucky to be alive. There's nothing I can do, isn't there?" Alejandro stood and moved to the windows, looking out at the sea. "Tell me about this Captain Valdez. What did he look like? What was his ship's heading?" "Why?" Isabella asked, though something in his tone made her pulse quicken. Alejandro turned back to her and she saw something dangerous and promising in his eyes. "Because, mi querida, the Venganza Negra has never been known to let such injustices go unanswered. And perhaps it's time you learned what it means to take your destiny into your own hands." Isabella stared at him, her mind reeling. Was he suggesting what she thought he was suggesting? "You would help me get my cargo back." "I would help you get your cargo back, your money, and perhaps a bit of interest for the inconvenience." Alejandro's smile was sharp as a cutlass. "But it wouldn't be charity, Isabella Moreau. You would earn it working alongside my crew. The sea is no place for passengers, only sailors." "I don't know anything about being a pirate," Isabella protested. "Neither did any of us when we started," Alejandro replied. "But we learned. The question is, are you brave enough to try? Or would you prefer I drop you at the nearest port so you can write letters to the authorities and hope they care about the troubles of a small plantation family?" Isabella thought about returning to Martinique empty-handed, about facing her parents with news of the lost cargo and her failure. Then she thought about Captain Valdez, probably laughing as he sold her family's spices to the highest bidder. The anger that rose in her chest was hot and clean, burning away her fear. "What would I have to do?" she asked. Alejandro's grin was triumphant. "First you recover fully. Then you learn to be useful aboard this ship. My crew doesn't respect titles or breeding, only competence and courage. If you can prove you have both, then we'll discuss hunting down the man who wronged you." Isabella set down the empty cup and looked directly into his dark eyes. "And if I can't prove myself worthy? Then you'll find yourself at the next friendly port with enough gold to book passage home and a story that will entertain your grandchildren," Alejandro replied. "But somehow I don't think that will be necessary." As if summoned by his words, a knock came at the cabin door. "Enter," Alejandro called. A weathered man with graying hair and intelligent eyes stepped inside. He wore the practical clothes of a ship's officer, and Isabella could see the respect in the way he looked at their captain. "Captain, the wind's picking up from the southeast. Miguel thinks we might catch that merchant convoy by dawn if we adjust our heading." "Excellent." Alejandro turned to Isabella. "This is Marcus Webb, my quartermaster and the closest thing this ship has to a voice of reason. Marcus, meet Isabella Moreau. She'll be joining us for a while." Marcus studied Isabella with the same calculating look she'd seen in Alejandro's eyes. "Can she work?" "We're about to find out," Alejandro replied. "Isabella, your first lesson begins now. This ship operates on discipline and mutual respect. Everyone contributes, from the captain to the newest crew member. Are you ready to begin?" Isabella felt a surge of determination unlike anything she'd ever experienced. The sheltered plantation daughter who had trusted Captain Valdez was gone, drowned in the Caribbean Sea. In her place was someone harder, someone who had stared death in the face and been pulled back by the hand of a pirate prince. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it. 3 weeks aboard the Venganza Negra had transformed Isabella in ways she never could have imagined. Her soft merchant daughter's hands were now calloused from rope work and armed combat practice. Her pale skin had bronzed under the Caribbean sun, and her hair, once elaborately styled, now hung in a practical braid down her back. Most importantly, the fear that had nearly consumed her on that piece of driftwood had been replaced by something far more useful: confidence. Again, shouted Carlos Santos, the ship's master-at-arms, as Isabella stumbled backward from his latest attack. A cutlass is not a dance partner, Chica. It wants to kill you. Treat it with the respect it deserves. Isabella wiped sweat from her brow and raised her blade again. Around them, other crew members had paused in their duties to watch the daily training session that had become something of a spectacle aboard the ship. She had progressed from barely being able to lift a sword to holding her own against some of the more experienced fighters, though Carlos remained frustratingly beyond her skill level. Focus on his eyes. Not his blade, called out James Mackenzie, a Scottish sailor who had become something of a mentor to her. The blade will follow where he looks. Isabella nodded and tried to implement his advice. This time, when Carlos lunged forward, she managed to sidestep and bring her own sword around in a counterattack that actually made contact with his guard. The crew cheered and she felt a flush of pride. Better, Carlos admitted grudgingly, but you're still thinking too much. Fighting is about instinct, not planning. Easy for you to say, Isabella panted, lowering her sword. You've been doing this for 20 years. 23, Carlos corrected with a grin. And every day I learn something new. The sea teaches us all if we're willing to listen. As the training session ended, Isabella noticed Alejandro watching from the quarterdeck. Over the past weeks, she had become acutely aware of his presence. The way he moved with fluid grace across the deck, how his voice carried just the right note of authority without being harsh, and the intelligence that flickered in his dark eyes when he thought no one was looking. He had proven to be an enigma. Despite his fearsome reputation, Isabella had seen him spend his own share of prize money to ensure injured crew members received proper medical care. He spoke multiple languages fluently and could discuss philosophy as easily as battle tactics. And yet, when the situation called for it, she had witnessed him transform into something genuinely terrifying. Just 2 days ago, they had encountered a Spanish naval vessel that had been pressing merchant ships into service and treating their crews brutally. Isabella had watched from behind the mainmast as Alejandro boarded the warship, his sword moving with deadly precision. But what had struck her wasn't his skill, it was his restraint. He could have killed every officer aboard, but instead he had demanded surrender, treated prisoners with respect, and freed the pressed men before sending the naval vessel on its way, with a warning about proper conduct. Isabella, Marcus Webb's voice interrupted her thoughts. Captain wants to see you in his cabin. Isabella's stomach fluttered nervously. These private meetings had become more frequent lately, and she was never quite sure what to expect. Alejandro had been teaching her navigation, ship management, and the complex web of alliances and enmities that governed life in the Caribbean. But there was always an undercurrent of something else, a tension that made her hyper-aware of his proximity and left her, feeling unsettled in ways she didn't fully understand. She found him bent over charts spread across his desk, his dark hair falling forward as he made calculations with a compass and ruler. The late afternoon sun slanted through the stern windows, casting everything in golden light. You wanted to see me, Captain? Alejandro looked up, and Isabella felt that familiar jolt when their eyes met. Yes, we've received word about Captain Valdez. Isabella's breath caught. Where is he? Port Royal, as it happens, selling your family's spices to British merchants at a considerable profit. Alejandro's voice was calm, but Isabella could see the anger in his expression. He's also been boasting about his cleverness in disposing of problematic cargo. The rage that rose in Isabella's chest was white-hot and pure. When do we take him? Alejandro smiled at her immediate response. Eager for vengeance, are we? Good, but this won't be a simple ship-to-ship battle. Valdez is protected by the British authorities in Port Royal. They take a percentage of his profits in exchange for looking the other way when he engages in less than legal activities. So, how do we get to him? Carefully, and with a plan that requires you to be more than just another crew member. Alejandro moved around the desk, coming close enough that Isabella could smell the salt air and leather that seemed to cling to him. I need you to go ashore dressed as a lady of quality and make contact with the British merchants who are buying your cargo. Isabella frowned. I don't understand. The merchants don't know the spices were stolen. As far as they're concerned, Valdez is a legitimate trader. But if the rightful owner were to appear, making claims and threatening legal action, Alejandro's smile was sharp. Well, it would make them very nervous about completing their transactions. You want me to be bait? I want you to be exactly what you are, Isabella Moreau, daughter of Philippe Moreau, rightful owner of the cargo Valdez is trying to sell. Alejandro's expression grew serious. But I won't lie to you about the dangers. If Valdez realizes you're alive, he'll try to eliminate you permanently. And this time he won't just throw you overboard. Isabella lifted her chin. I'm not afraid of him anymore. Perhaps not. But are you afraid of what you might become? Alejandro asked quietly. Revenge changes people, Isabella. Once you cross certain lines, you can't go back to being the innocent merchant's daughter who trusted the wrong captain. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Isabella thought about the woman she had been just weeks ago, sheltered, naive, dependent on others to protect her. Then she thought about the woman she was becoming, stronger, more dangerous, capable of standing on her own deck and holding her own in a fight. The innocent merchant's daughter died in the Caribbean Sea. She said finally, I'm someone else now. Alejandro studied her face for a long moment, and Isabella had the strange feeling he was seeing something in her that she wasn't even aware of herself. Yes, he said softly. You are. He moved to a sea chest against the far wall and withdrew a bundle of fine fabric. These were my sisters, he said, his voice carrying a note of old pain. She died 3 years ago, killed by Spanish soldiers who thought her husband was harboring pirates. She would have liked you, I think. She had your courage. Isabella accepted the bundle, feeling the weight of trust in the gesture. As she unfolded the fabric, she gasped. It was a gown of deep blue silk, beautifully made and obviously expensive. With it came a matching cloak, silk stockings, and even delicate leather slippers. Alejandro, I can't. You can and you will, he interrupted, and you'll wear them while you walk into the most dangerous situation of your life, knowing that your success or failure will determine not just your own fate, but the fate of everyone aboard this ship. Isabella looked up from the gown to find Alejandro watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. You have that much faith in me? I have that much faith in the woman you've become, he replied. The question is whether you have faith in yourself. As Isabella stood there holding her sister's gown, she realized that somewhere in the past 3 weeks, her goals had shifted. It was no longer just about recovering her family's cargo or getting revenge on Captain Valdez. It was about proving herself worthy of the trust Alejandro was placing in her, worthy of the crew that had accepted her, worthy of the life she was choosing to build from the ashes of her old one. When do we reach Port Royal? She asked. Tomorrow at dawn. Alejandro moved back to his charts, but Isabella could feel his attention still focused on her. You'll go ashore in the afternoon when the markets are busiest. Marcus will accompany you as your manservant. He knows Port Royal well and can keep you safe if things go wrong. And if they go right? Alejandro's smile was fierce and proud. Then Captain Valdez will learn what it means to cross the pirate prince and the woman he chose to save. Port Royal buzzed with the controlled chaos of commerce as Isabella, resplendent in the blue silk gown, made her way through the crowded streets accompanied by Marcus Webb. The quartermaster had transformed himself remarkably well for the role of manservant, his weathered face carefully composed into the neutral expression of a well-trained domestic. But Isabella could see the alertness in his eyes as they navigated through the throngs of merchants, sailors, and colonial officials. Remember, Marcus murmured as they approached the merchant district, you're a lady of quality whose cargo was stolen. You're angry but controlled, demanding satisfaction, not revenge. Isabella nodded, her heart racing despite her outward calm. Through her weeks aboard the Venganza Negra, she had learned to project confidence, but this was different. This required her to be both the sheltered plantation daughter she had been and the strong woman she had become. A delicate balance that could mean the difference between success and disaster. The first merchant they visited, a portly Englishman named Thompson, received them in his well-appointed office overlooking the harbor. Isabella could see the Santa Esperanza anchored among the other vessels, and the sight of it filled her with cold rage. Miss Moreau, Thompson said after she had explained her situation, I must say this is quite disturbing. Captain Valdez assured me that all his cargo was legitimately acquired. Captain Valdez is a thief and a would-be murderer, Isabella replied, allowing just enough emotion to show in her voice. Those spices belong to my family's plantation in Martinique. I have the bills of lading and export documents to prove it. She produced The papers Alejandro had helped her forge. Documents that were technically fraudulent but contained enough accurate information to be convincing. Thompson examined them carefully, his expression growing increasingly troubled. If what you say is true, Miss Moreau, then I've been unknowingly trafficking in stolen goods. This could ruin my reputation. It could do more than that, Isabella said quietly. The French colonial authorities take theft from their citizens very seriously, and I understand the British Navy has been cracking down on piracy and illegal trading. Thompson's face paled. Isabella could see him calculating the potential consequences. Lost money was one thing, but imprisonment or loss of his trading license would destroy him completely. What would you have me do? He asked. Refuse to complete the transaction, Isabella replied. Return the cargo to its rightful owner, and help me see that justice is done. Thompson nodded eagerly. Of course. I'll contact the harbor master immediately. Captain Valdez will not be permitted to leave port until this matter is resolved. Isabella smiled graciously. You're a man of honor, Mr. Thompson. I won't forget your cooperation. As they left Thompson's office, Marcus shook his head admiringly. That was well done, lass. You've got him so frightened he'll do whatever you ask. One merchant down, 2 to go, Isabella replied. But as they walked toward their next destination, she noticed a familiar figure emerging from a tavern ahead. Captain Valdez, looking prosperous and pleased with himself, was deep in conversation with 2 men Isabella didn't recognize. Marcus, she whispered urgently. I see him, the quartermaster replied. Keep walking. Don't let him notice you, but it was too late. Valdez glanced in their direction, and Isabella saw the exact moment when recognition dawned in his eyes. His face went white, then red with fury and fear. Impossible, she heard him breathe. Then louder, You! It cannot be. Isabella felt Marcus tense beside her, his hand moving subtly toward the knife concealed under his coat. But she stood her ground, meeting Valdez's shocked stare with cool composure. Captain Valdez, she said politely, how unexpected to see you here. Valdez stumbled forward, his companions following with confused expressions. You're dead, he said hoarsely. I threw you into the sea myself. You're dead! Clearly not, Isabella replied. Though I understand you've been profiting handsomely from my supposed demise. Who is this woman, Valdez? One of his companions asked. You look like you've seen a ghost. She was... Valdez struggled for words, clearly trying to decide how much to reveal. Finally, he seemed to collect himself. Miss Moreau, I thought you had drowned in that terrible storm. Thank God you survived. Isabella had to admire his quick thinking, even as she despised him. Oh yes, the storm. The same one that somehow caused my entire cargo to end up in your hold instead of at the bottom of the sea. Valdez's eyes darted around nervously, clearly aware that they were drawing attention from passers-by. Perhaps we could discuss this privately. There seems to have been some sort of misunderstanding. No misunderstanding, Isabella said firmly. You stole my cargo and left me to die. The only question now is what you intend to do about it. That is... Valdez was sweating despite the afternoon breeze. Miss Moreau, surely we can reach some sort of arrangement. The only arrangement I'm interested in is the return of my property and appropriate compensation for your attempted murder, Isabella interrupted. I've already spoken with the merchants you've been dealing with. They're quite concerned about their reputations. Valdez's face went from red to purple. You dare threaten me? You're nothing but a spoiled colonial girl who doesn't understand how the world works. I understand it better than you think, Isabella replied. I also understand that the British authorities frown on captains who throw passengers overboard and steal cargo. I wonder what they would make of your story about a convenient storm. For a moment, Isabella thought Valdez might actually attack her right there in the street, but then his expression changed, becoming calculating and dangerous. Perhaps you're right, Miss Moreau. Perhaps we do need to settle this matter once and for all. His smile was cold and predatory. Why don't you meet me aboard the Santa Esperanza this evening? We can discuss terms privately. Isabella felt Marcus's hand tighten warningly on her arm, but she ignored it. I think not, Captain. Any discussions we have will be in the presence of witnesses and preferably the harbor master. Valdez shrugged as if it didn't matter. As you wish. But Miss Moreau, accidents happen in Port Royal. Ships disappear. People go missing. It would be a shame if you survived the sea only to meet with misfortune on dry land. The threat was unmistakable, and Isabella felt a chill run down her spine, but she kept her voice steady. "Are you threatening me, Captain?" "I'm simply observing that Port Royal can be dangerous for young women traveling alone," Valdez replied. "Perhaps you should consider leaving town, tonight." With that, he turned and stalked away, his companions hurrying to keep up. Isabella stood watching until they disappeared into the crowd, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. "Well," Marcus said quietly, "that could have gone better." "Could it have?" Isabella asked. "He's desperate now." "Desperate people make mistakes. They also do desperate things," Marcus replied grimly. "We need to get back to the ship. The captain needs to know about this." As they made their way back toward the harbor, Isabella reflected on how much she had changed. 3 weeks ago, the encounter with Valdez would have left her terrified and helpless. Now, while she was certainly afraid, she was also planning. Valdez had shown his hand. He was going to try to eliminate her before she could cause more damage to his business. But this time, she wouldn't be a helpless victim floating on a piece of wood. This time, she had allies. She had skills. And she had something Valdez couldn't understand. She had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The Venganza Negra came into view as they reached the docks, her black hull gleaming in the afternoon sun. Isabella could see Alejandro standing at the rail, and even at this distance she could sense his alertness. He had been watching for their return, probably tracking their progress through a spyglass. "Isabella," he called as they approached. "How did it go?" "Better than expected, but with complications," she replied as Marcus helped her up the rope ladder. It was awkward in the silk gown, but she had learned to manage such things over the past weeks. Once on deck, she quickly explained the encounters with Thompson and Valdez. Alejandro listened intently, his expression growing darker with each detail. "He threatened you openly?" he asked when she finished. "As openly as he dared in a public street," Isabella confirmed. "He wants me to leave Port Royal tonight. And he'll make sure you disappear if you don't," Alejandro said grimly. "The question is whether we give him the chance." "What do you mean?" Isabella asked. Alejandro's smile was sharp and dangerous. "I mean, mi querida, that it's time Captain Valdez learned the difference between threatening an innocent merchant's daughter and threatening someone under the protection of the pirate prince." As the sun set over Port Royal, painting the harbor in shades of gold and crimson, Isabella stood at the rail of the Venganza Negra and watched the lights begin to twinkle on shore. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation with Valdez, and she knew that whatever happened, there would be no going back to her old life. But as she felt Alejandro's presence beside her and heard the quiet conversations of the crew preparing for whatever lay ahead, Isabella realized she didn't want to go back. The woman she had become, strong, capable, dangerous when necessary, was someone she was proud to be. "Ready for tomorrow?" Alejandro asked softly. Isabella turned to him, seeing her own determination reflected in his dark eyes. "I've been ready since the moment you pulled me from the waves," she replied, and as the Caribbean stars began to appear overhead, Isabella Moreau, merchant's daughter turned pirate, victim turned avenger, prepared to claim her destiny at last.